As Dominic mentioned, we were bridges with Adara. Prior to joining Adara 18 months ago, I spent more than 9 years at Visit St. Pete Clearwater in Florida, third largest destination in the state as Vice President of Digital Communications. So, I am one of yours. I'm a DOO brethren, okay? Understand the challenges that you face, potentially in-house and with stakeholders. With that, a couple of personal introductions from my colleagues here, my panelists, Cimin and Eddie. Go for it.
Sure. Hi guys, my name is Eddie. I currently work at Visit St. Pete Clearwater. Prior to that, I was with Visit Sarasota. Started out my career, went to California to live in a little mountain town, Big Bear Lake, as the Director of Marketing and Communications there. And then obviously hopping back to sunny St. Pete Clearwater. So that's a little about me.
My name is Ahmadi-Cohen, and I have an advertising agency called Peddler. My background's in media planning and buying, so that's my specialty, my baby, and what obviously we're going to be talking about today. We've been working with travel tourism clients for as long as we've been around, just about 8 years. One of which is New Mexico Tourism Department, one of our longest running clients, and so we're feeling very fortunate to have our partners in the mix.
Awesome. Thank you two for joining for this session. So I want to just kind of outline the situation when it comes to data and DMOs. And I think these are some of the challenges really that face the industry and organizations. Some that I face directly and some that have kind of a little bit more modern, a little bit very, very, very recent. But obviously DMOs don't control the point of sale. So oftentimes I feel like when we encounter or talk about the conversation about data, a lot of DMOs say, we just don't have a lot of customer data. So the conversation's not super relevant. And what we're going to dive into is that doesn't have to be the case, right? You can actually take the lead in maximizing and privatizing your data. Shout out to Amplify, the last group. One of my big questions, actually, that I didn't get a chance to ask them is, it's a free platform, and that's awesome, but man, let's find a way for DMOs to be able to harness that first-party data that those customers are actually entering and buying on the website, because that can power marketing in the future. So that challenge of DMOs not controlling the point of sale and that conversion, bridging that gap and finding ways to do that. And so we're going to tackle some of that. Obviously, data privacy changes. We won't dwell on that a ton. And then one of the items though that we will get into is owning that data on the marketing side. So any of the marketing programs you're out there buying, you're paying for those audiences. And the idea of kind of changing that from a leasing situation to an owning situation, we're going to dive more into that. So that's a little bit of the landscape here, kind of items and challenges we're trying to tackle. And going to ask two panelists to dive in a little bit more about their journey. But first, data project, right? Like freak out, we're going to talk data, and it's going to get confusing, and I promise you it won't. But this is at large what a public consortium looks like, a data public consortium. Bringing data in, and this is what we do at Adara, right? We bring data in from 300 plus travel and tourism partners and build an identity graph for our partners to be able to leverage. Was that a cowbell? Okay, this would have been like the most cowbell slide. I thought I heard one. Okay, I appreciate that. So this is what we do. What we're doing now is extending that whole concept and idea, but for destinations. So privatizing your data, again, website data, CRM data, any of your individual partners, their booking data. Think attractions, think hotels. Don't get hives or anxiety when I say that, because I know stakeholders can get very provincial about their own data. But that's the general concept to kind of support and solve some of the situation that I mentioned. I'm going to skip over the client slide. So, Visit St. Pete Clearwater, New Mexico via Peddler and Tallwig. Why don't you guys kind of jump in and talk about a little bit of your journey and why you guys have prioritized maximizing your data and really owning this conversation. Cimin, if you want to start us off, still onboarding. And again, I kind of like the difference in these perspectives, right? An agency with a state level DMO and an in-house client at a regional city DMO.
Yeah. So we first started talking about data management platforms for the state back in 2015. My background was from big agency and programmatic, like that's what everybody was doing at the time. It was Blue Kite Oracle, which was the solution that what everybody was moving to. And everybody recognized the need for it, but as Leroy said, it was not like a pants on fire issue because we didn't have a ton of first party data to put into that. So we didn't have this massive need of millions of data points to try to harness. And then as the years went on, we continued to have that conversation, but we ultimately, this past year, came to this critical confluence of events that happened where we had a firm date for cookies sunsetting, and we had, I don't know how many of you were in the market with advertising campaigns during the pandemic when they just like absolute boom with e-commerce, but a client called and said, they were running a campaign with another partner and they said, "Are you seeing this in Facebook?" And I was like, "What's going on?" And she said, "Well, we were told we were going to get this CPM. That's how the program was pitched, and they cannot get it to deliver for less than it's 2x the cost right now." Because basically we saw that all the data and all those segments that were in there, just like the demand was out of control, and they lost control over being able to harness how much that was going to cost them. So that all kind of came together in this moment of recognizing that we had to take the data in-house and have the ability, once we also saw through consortium the ability to layer on first-party data with scoring segments that provide that intent, that provide that indication of like really strategic value consumer under that, not just, these are people that have signed up to our newsletter, so we want more lookalikes of them. It's not necessarily the greatest lookalike audience to go after. So how do we bridge those things and create a cross-section that's actually valuable, and then also being able to take those segments and deploy them anywhere we want, instead of just having version A of a segment over here and version B of a segment over here and version C over here. We're taking an amalgamation of third party and second party and some first party and lookalike. How do we create real holistic audiences that we can scale across the platforms, measure across those platforms, to be able to get into the nuances of how do we start to score strategic value consumers from just anybody who wants to take a trip to New Mexico, which people could be traveling, as we said earlier, they have to go to a funeral tomorrow. Are they necessarily going to that place because that is an intended travel visitor? Is that a marketable overnight trip? No. So we have to have those kinds of segments and that detail. So we found this as the opportunity and the right time to move into that space, and then obviously the privacy component of it, moving to tokenized UID2, where we have unique identifiers and we are able to be prepared in advance of cookie sunsetting. What I did not want to have happen is they finally stopped pushing the deadline back and then we're okay, it's here, don't worry, things are going to be fine, we'll just see how it goes. We now have a plan in place so that we are not in that situation, and if they continue to push it back, fine, but at least we have a better plan in place for anonymized, tokenized data.
So a couple things real quick. Tokenized UID2, that we're geeking out. That's awesome. I'd love you to mention that because that's what we're talking about. Pretty advanced data capabilities here. The other thing is, you mean newsletter signups aren't the best source of bookings? Wow, shocker. Eddie, I know you've got some thoughts on that in terms of just because I signed up for a newsletter 3 years ago doesn't mean anything about where I'm looking to travel next. Past behavior doesn't always dictate future behavior, right? Just because you've traveled someplace once before doesn't mean you're going to travel there again in the future. Eddie, a little bit about Visit St. Clearwater's journey and why are you going down this path?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so a little thing about me that wasn't shared as well. I majored in philosophy in addition to journalism, so I've always kind of leaned toward existential questions. And I think for us as DMOs, there's some good conversation we can have when we ask ourselves some important questions about the utilization of our data. So for us, it's really leaning towards maximizing the data that we do collect. So I want to ask you guys some questions. So get out the cowbells, and I'll do this with you. How many people here measure and report destination guides to stakeholders? All right. How many people measure and report, your newsletter signups as another KPI. Okay, all right.
Some audience participation here.
Come on guys, this is the last
Let's
segment.
go.
Then you get a drink.
Drinks are next.
All right, how many people have ever run a contest as part of a DMO? All right, so, okay, you did all that, you collected the data. What are you doing with the data afterwards? How are you using that to do digital targeting? And for us, for a long time, we collected contest, signups. We would put them into our newsletter if they opted in to do that. But in terms of, measuring the marketing effectiveness of some of those activations, it was really kind of, that's all we did. So in terms of, the question of how do we maximize the data that we're collecting, that's always been very important to us. A couple of other questions that I'll leave for you guys to kind of talk about that are things that we think about from the DMO side. Do you trust your ROI sources? And I think that's a growing question when we're seeing diminishing observable data that's not from first-party data inputs. So like your pixel tracking, if you have opted into Google Analytics recently, in terms of like the geolocation data that you're seeing, it's probably way different than it was a few months ago. Well, that's because we're able to observe less of it. Same thing with pixel tracking even. So those were concerns for us and why we were sort of leaning towards how can we better utilize our first-party data. And when we put our data into a data consortium, what are we even able to match that information to?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So some of the outcomes you both touched on like the whys for you individually. These are some other outcomes that we're seeing in terms of investing in the infrastructure that is onboarding destination data into a clean room in a GDPR, CCPA compliant manner, privacy first. One of the ones that I really want to call out, the state of Utah is doing this with an agency called Love Communications, and absolutely it blows my mind a little bit because A/B testing in my many years was just simply, hey, what ad is driving more clicks? And Cimin, I know you, in our conversations, you had cited a study from years ago that the best clickers are not the best buyers. We know that. Right? They're accidental clicks. They're just not the right people. They're optimizing their ad performance based off of bookings. And they say, hey, give us 2 weeks, and we're going to be able to tell you which ad is driving more bookings. Actual purchases, not extrapolated, not a sample size, actual purchase in market. And these are some of those outcomes that you can realize with some of this infrastructure, in addition to some of the obviously the outcomes that we're pursuing with you all. One thing a couple of visuals that we wanted to share. Again, back to the comment about I'm not really sure how much data we have. Shout out to Gray Lowry, who was here, I think still, hopefully he didn't go, he's here. He actually built this, he's with Miles. He built this visualization using what's now Looker Google Data Studio. This is showing you the onboarding of tokens, so anonymous IDs, people we have not linked to an identity, over time. You can see Business City Clearwater started working with us and Miles on this project last August. And in that time, we've onboarded almost 34 million tokens, and we've connected those to an identity, an actual person, 28 million of those. The steady amount that you see over time is website visitation. So every day, this is we deploy something called an SDK, a software development kit. Get a little nerdy on you. It's much more powerful than a pixel. And what it allows is the onboarding of these identities to then be able to do some of the things that we talked about. That big spike, a couple of those big spikes, are using things called log files, impression log files. Every campaign that is run, including CTV, and you talked about some of the CTV, there was a CTV session earlier on measurement. All of those have log files attached to it, essentially a receipt for who served the impression, a time, a date, and a device ID. We can actually import those IDs into the clean room. You can measure outcomes from a CTV ad. Did they search or did they book? And you can remarket to these people. So it's closing the loop with what they're doing. Eddie, I want you to, I'm going to skip through here some of this, some really powerful capabilities that this is St. Peter is doing. Track down Gray or Eddie to dive in more. But talk to us about these top performing audiences. So to your point, capturing the audiences, ingesting them into the clean room, and then pushing them out into the marketplace to be able to actually measure, hey, these are the IDs we've collected, and how are they actually performing against other first-party audience sets that we're buying on the marketplace. Talk to us about kind of this process and what you're looking to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I think really right now at this stage, we're looking to understand how we can utilize the Adara data consortium. So, just benchmarking, comparing the other first-party, data sets that we might be purchasing or other things, and seeing how they perform, as well as how we're not doing a test against one or the other, but just trying to improve our own first-party data as an active tool. We are thinking about not just the visitor cycle anymore, but kind of the data cycle. So, how the data is input, where we can utilize it, how we can continue to kind of, every time someone visits, there's so much data that you can potentially collect and learn about that visitor to then remarket or, target new audiences that match a similar profile.
Thanks for that. Again, this is kind of next level marketing performance measurement. We're talking about, again, some of these first-party audiences at zero cost, $0. So if you can get a free audience, essentially, obviously you got to pay for some of the infrastructure, but if you can get a free audience that you can activate, that can perform at the same level of these audiences who are costing you money, there's a ton of efficiency and value there. That's the input, right? That's the purpose. Cimin, as we get out of here, I know we're short on time. Any final thoughts and/or talking about some of the value and the process of that data enrichment that you mentioned a little bit?
Yeah, I think also I remember the first time we talked and I was listening to all the things, I was like, oh my gosh, that is a whole buffet of a lot of stuff that we're not ready to go full-scale Utah level today. And actually at ESTO, hearing Arkansas talk about his process of onboarding, and just giving some reassurance that it is not you have to hit the buffet and eat every single part of Adara consortium style, ingesting data, all of that kind of stuff. You can start so simply with just understanding who's coming to your website and deploying against that in a scored segment way, and thinking about doing that and pacing that out. But what I would say is you can't do nothing. The option of sitting on anonymized cookies or whatever version of that, it's just not even accurate anymore. And we all know it. We all get Instagram and Facebook ads that are just, I'm being targeted as a golfer. I'm obviously not a golfer. Shouldn't say obviously, but I'm not a golfer.
Obviously.
Yeah, would like to be a golfer. So it's inaccurate. It's increasingly inaccurate. So even just starting with the very first step of SDK from your website and pulling in any transactional data, if you can get all the partners on board, great, but maybe view that as a 2.0 version and just start with what can you understand and unlock about your audiences and tapping into them to target niche audiences and add, increased accountability for your campaigns as a starting point.
So as we wrap, this is of course our data set, but she mentioned Arkansas. Arkansas is actually using the infrastructure to onboard campsite data, right? So their parks are massive in the state of Arkansas. They want to understand how many bookings and searches are we driving into our park reservation platform. So we're onboarding that first-party conversion and search data from the park's website into the consortium, into their clean room, and they can now see outcomes, post-campaign, mid-campaign, on how that's being driven. So when we talk about onboarding partners, it doesn't have to be campgrounds, it could be hotels, independent hotels, attractions, etc. You can scan this QR code, I'll send you the deck, you can track me down, we can have a drink. Thank you for hanging in there at the back end of day 2. Appreciate you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.